Empathy and understanding are the heart of successful communication. Ruben Studdard said that empathy is the most important skill in our communication toolbox. Understand someone, and then, only then, can you make your point. Hi, welcome to Game Animation Fundamentals for Everyone. My name is Candace DeBacker. I'm a principal animator at Timber Games. My pronouns are she, her. And before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge, me and my studio would like to acknowledge that Timber, we work all across Turtle Island, which is what our First Nations refer to as Canada. We mostly work on the unceded territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the, I'm sorry, I forget how to pronounce the third one, but I will find it later. Yeah, so today I want to talk about the fundamentals of game animation, just so that you can gain a better understanding of what is important to game animators when making a game, and so that you can better collaborate with your animators. For me, I created this talk originally because I was mentoring with Women in Animation International, and then I gave the talk to my studio, and later one of the engineers came to me and said that the talk really helped them think about how they can code like an animator, which I thought was so cool, and which led me to want to give this talk here. So the game animation fundamentals, as pegged by Jonathan Cooper in his book Game Anim, are as follows: context, feel, readability, fluidity, and elegance. And I'm going to go into those more as we go through them. So context is the who, what, when, where, why. Animation is a visual communication style. So we really want to know what we're trying to communicate to our player. And that is what context is all about. So one of the main things we're trying to communicate is who our characters are in our game, and how they move is a big way to communicate that. So as you can see here, this is Joe. This is the VP of North America Sumo, and he's Skater Joe in this comic drawn by Jeff Coates, our creative director. And over here, this is Lombon's movement analysis chart. I have a theater background, and this is a chart created by Lombon, who is a choreographer and dancer. It's also commonly used by actors, and I think it's really useful as an animator as well. So using this chart, you can figure out what Lombon referred to as the 8 efforts, which are variations of movement styles. And I thought it'd be fun if we tried to figure out how Joe might move. So I need a little bit of audience participation here if you guys just want to yell at me. Do we think that Skater Joe would move in a light or heavy way? Light? Okay, great. So there's space and focus, which might be, it's not very self-explanatory. So indirect or direct is a bit, I find that a little easier to understand. It's basically, are you going to move from point A to point B in a linear fashion, or are you going to sort of go all over the place before you get from point A to point B? So how do we think that Skater Joe will move, indirect or direct? Indirect? Okay, great. Do we think that Joe is a fast or a slow skater? Fast? Slow? I'm hearing mixed messages. I need some more. Which one's louder? Slow? Okay, great. So far, they're light on their feet, they're indirect, and they're slow. How about energy and flow? So this one also isn't super self-explanatory to me, at least. It took me a bit of time to understand this one. I think that relaxed and tense is the easiest way for me to understand this. Is he like really nervous? Do you think that he's like gonna fall and he's really scared about it? Or do you think he's like, oh, I'm great, I'm just having a great time? So relaxed or tense? Relaxed? Okay, great. So Joe's having a great time. They're lightly skating along, they're doing like spins and stuff indirectly, moving around, and they're slow, they're chill, and they're just having a good time. So thank you. So going over something like this with like your designers and your narrative team, and the animators is like a great way to get alignment on how a character might move and get a better understanding of their personality. There are times when you might want to go like middle slider on all of these, meaning you want like a generic animation, if per se it's an animation that's going to be used across a lot of characters, and that's also something that should probably be talked about beforehand whether or not this animation is going to be used with a bunch of different characters. Ugh, excuse me, I'm going to get some water real quick. Another thing we really want to communicate to our players is the status of our characters. This is sort of a diegetic UI thing. So instead of having a really loaded HUD, you can communicate some status effects to your player on the actual character. In, I think, a Dead Space game, they had the HP bar on the outfit of the character. So you could see your character is usually where your player is going to be looking. So having information there is great for the player, because I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I'll die in a game and I'll be like, I didn't even know I was dying. I didn't even know I was hurt. So having some status effects to communicate that to your player really helps, especially in a place that they're already looking at. So grounding in reality. Animation can also explain the environment you're in, whether you're in a dangerous situation or not. It also sort of immerses the character in the world if your character is interacting with the world around it. When I first saw like The Last Guardian and the kid put his hand on a pot nearby, I was like, oh my God, the kid knows that the pot's there. That's amazing. They mostly do this through IK, which is inverse kinematics. There's like a point in space that your hand snaps to, or as you can see here, the kid is looking up at Trico. So there's a point in space that the head knows to look towards. And doing stuff like this makes your character feel like they actually know where they are. Have you ever been in a game where you go and like walk to the very edge of a cliff and your character's just doing the normal idle animation? Not really, and it feels like the character doesn't really know that if you take one more step, they're just gonna die. If you had like a specific animation for them being like, ugh, it would feel like they actually know where they are in space, which would help immerse them in that space. Inside does a great job of this. They have so many animations that are specific. They have one for like wading through knee-high water. And in this scene in particular, they need to pretend to walk like everyone else. So their entire locomotion set changes, which is really cool. So the next fundamental is feel. That's me. So feel has to do a lot with game feel. I think there's a talk I saw about juice is commonly a game feel term. For animation, usually this has to do with responsiveness and making sure that when you're having this conversation with your player, this visual communication dialogue, there's an input by the player and we have a response in the game. And then the player sees this response and then they have another input and there's this conversation that happens. And for animation, we want to make sure that it doesn't feel laggy. I think for the most part, you want your animations to have the player input and then have the least amount of frames possible between that and the outcome. Like in this animation here that I animated on Tom, you can see that he kicks and there's very few frames between what I call the idle pose and the hit frame. So the hit frame being when it actually makes contact and deals damage to whatever character they're hitting. So this pose here I would call the anticipation. Anticipation is commonly referred to as the action before the action. So like if you have a punch, you're going to wind up before you punch. And if you're going to throw, you're going to wind up before you throw. A throw without a wind up isn't going to go very far. It's going to be pretty weak. And then this over here is the smear frame. It gets from the anticipation to the hit frame. I'm going to talk about that more later. I keep on forgetting that I put the POW in there. In other situations for like enemy characters, you're going to want to have a lot of anticipation because you want to give your player time to dodge and time to interact. They need to be able to see that the player needs to see that the enemy is doing an attack. And if you can describe to the player what kind of attack it's going to be and where it's going to head. So as you can see in this animation, they're raising it up and it's pretty obvious that it's going to be a straight slam down. Sometimes you want to make sure it's obvious that you do a wide sweep. What kind of animation is it going to be? Where do you want to dodge? These are all things you should probably communicate to your player. and it will make them feel really good if they can successfully dodge. A lot of times you can get a lot more out of this if you collaborate with audio and visual effects to give a tell for when the time for a perfect dodge would be. A perfect dodge being the last minute moment that someone could successfully dodge an attack. For player animations, there's also times when you want to have a lot of anticipation. It's not, you don't want super responsive animations for all the time, because we tend to think of having a lot of anticipation as power. So the more anticipation you have, the more powerful the attack is going to feel. So if you have a charged attack, then holding that charge longer is going to feel more powerful. And if you want to make it seem like an action is really difficult, adding more anticipation and making the animation slower is going to make it feel heavier. The next fundamental is readability. In this visual communication style, we need to make sure that our player understands, they can actually see what we're trying to communicate. That's one of the most important parts of having a conversation with your players, making sure that your message is clear. It feels so weird drinking water in front of a bunch of people. So one of the ways as animators that we need to make sure that our message is clear is through silhouettes. Silhouettes are a great way for animators to know if this pose is clear. Do we understand what's happening here? I think hopefully you can tell that Tom is in a dance pose. Tom is like a little ballerina. And for video game animation, we don't really know where our camera is going to be. Which way are we going to be viewing this character? So we need to make sure the silhouette is understandable from multiple directions, which is where video game animation mostly diverts from cinematics, TVs, movies, because they know where their camera is going to be and they can animate to camera. So I think I'm a big believer in making sure that you view your game animations from the game camera. I don't think that reviews should be done in Maya or whatever animation software you're using, because it's not a good representation of what your player is going to be seeing. So I like to get the animation in a really rough stage in the engine as soon as possible, which is great because engineers can tell me if I need to iterate on it early as possible. And then we also get to review the animation from the player's point of view, which I think is really important. As you can see in this animation, from Maya, the head looks like it's really far up. Like, I feel like if I walked around like this all day, my neck would really hurt. But from the game camera, it looks completely normal. And actually, if you didn't crank the neck up like that, you wouldn't be able to see the character's face. So normally in like top-down or 2.5 view cameras, you sort of need to do that, but it looks really weird from Maya or any software you use. One of the things that, oh no, I clicked the wrong button. Do I just click this one again? Ooh, oh, okay, great. Okay, so one of the ways that other teams can help animators make our message more clear is, like I said before, through visual effects and audio. So as you can see here, these visual effects helped explain where the animation was headed. The sense of direction and impact was helped by this visual effect. And then audio does so much for describing what an animation does as well, but I didn't want to put audio in because it doesn't really work in presentations sometimes. Sorry, audio. As you can see here, sense of direction, impact, they're super useful, especially if you have a camera in the game that's super far away, like in League of Legends, like the other slide I showed. The next fundamental is fluidity. So fluidity is making your animations feel the most natural, making sure one pose leads to another in an elegant way. Not to do with the elegance fundamental, but so over here we see, this is a state machine in Unreal Engine 5. So it's describing how one animation set goes to another. So here we have the locomotion animation set. This is like the idle, the walk, the run. And as you can see here, you can go into the jump animation, which would go into the fall animation, into the land, and back to the locomotion. You can also go straight from locomotion into falling to land to locomotion. And that's because you might just walk off a ledge right into the fall animation. And the fall is a loop, which means that the first frame and the last frame are the same, and it can loop indefinitely because we don't know how far our character is going to be falling. So making sure that all of these move into each other pretty smoothly has to do with blend speeds and making sure that the poses work well with each other. These little white dots are conditions for transitioning and blend speeds. So if you double clicked on that, you'd be able to open up conditions. Probably in this fall loop one, it would be a Boolean, which is like a true or false. And it's like, is the character currently in the air? If they are, play the fall loop, stuff like that. And usually between the locomotion to the fall loop, we'd want the blend to be sort of long. And then between the fall loop to the land, we want that to be pretty fast. Could I get someone to come up here? Would anyone want to volunteer to come jump for me? Yeah? No? Yeah? Yeah, come on up. Thank you so much. Yay! Yes, give him a hand. If you could stand right there so everyone can see you. So I'd love if you can demonstrate sort of each of these motions and how we can put them together. So could you do the, yeah, exactly. Do like the crouch, the anticipation for the jump. Yeah. If you want to hold the down first and then hold that for 10 minutes and then, no, I'm kidding. Yeah, so as you can see, just do the jump part without falling if you can, as best you can. Have you done miming school before? Yeah, that's the fall loop. That's great. And then the landing animation. Yeah. So as you can see, and then do it all together. And then do all of them together. Yeah. Thank you so much. What was your name? Raphael. Thank you, Raphael. Everyone give Raphael a hand. Thank you so much. So as Raphael just demonstrated, these animations can look a little strange if you just do them individually, although his looked great. But like having them all together the way that we do in a world with real gravity, it can be a little challenging, especially if we don't know how far they're falling or how fast they're falling. So it's a little difficult to make sure that they all blend fluidly together. And it takes a little bit of zhuzhing and a lot of iteration. So one of the most important poses in the game for fluidity's sake, is the idle pose. So this is a pretty relaxed idle pose. My hands are crossed and I got my hip to one side. And you can't really imagine me being able to punch pretty good from this pose. It would take a bit to get my arms uncrossed and shift my weight. So this probably isn't a great pose for combat's sake or being active in any way. So great transition. I'm definitely an animator. So this is a bit more of an active pose. From this pose, I can more easily get into like a dodge, an attack, anything like that. I could jump more easier from this one. I'd also recommend if you're making an idle pose, have the hand that's back be the one that's going to be doing the first attack because it sort of has built-in anticipation. So if your hand is back here and you want to do an attack, you don't need to wind up as far back. So you can do a quicker anticipation. I'll get water again. Don't look at me. And then next I just have a demonstration of what a 2D blend space looks like. In the other slide with the locomotion state machine, this is sort of an example of what that looks like. This is a 2D blend space. So we have the idle animation is this dot, this is the walk, and far all the way over there is the run. And as you can see, I'm sort of dragging between it. So this is a way to make sure that you have like a fluid blend between all of these types of locomotion. And if it doesn't look smooth, try adding another animation in there. But for the most part, you can get a pretty good blend with just this many animations, which saves you on animation time, which leads us into our next fundamental, which is elegance. And elegance, I feel like elegance is not a self-explanatory term for what this one is. It's also called getting the most bang for your buck, which I think might be make more sense to me. So Elegance is all about making sure that you know your priorities, animation scoping, making sure that you know what your priorities are so that you can put more work towards those. If you view your animations in the engine, then you're going to know whether or not you even see that animation very much. Maybe you don't want to put like a whole month towards polishing that animation that you see once from really far away, and you might want to put it towards other stuff. So this is a clip from Potionomics by Voracious Games, and I think they did a really smart thing by taking Fluidity and tossing it out the window for the sake of having really expressive character animations in their dialogue system. So they knew that their priority was having expressive dialogue, and they didn't want every one of their animations to go back to an idle pose, because then they wouldn't be able to have these really dramatic poses. They could, but it would take a lot of scope to make a bunch of animations that go from this animation to this animation, and then so on and so forth. It would take a lot of animation scope. So they made their choice for what time they wanted to use wisely, and I think it worked out really well for them. A talk that I think is really great, if you want to look more into this, is Doing More with Less. It's a GDC talk by Stephen Dickinson. And it talks about how in Gears of War 4, they used a tool called motion warping so that they could vault over or wall climb, mantle a bunch of different objects of different sizes using a limited amount of animations. They said that using this tool, they were able to reduce animation scope from 162 animations to 6 animations, which is great. So basically the motion warping, it sort of senses the objects in the engine, and then it changes the animation's translation and rotation to match that object better. So using these types of tools at your disposal and sort of researching what you can use to reduce animation scope is a great way to make sure that you're using your time the best way possible, and getting aligned with your team to make sure that you know what's the most important for you as a team and you as a game, so you know where to put your efforts. The most important part, I think, for making sure that you are tackling a game with elegance and making sure that you are using the right scope is making sure that you get on the same page as the rest of your team before you start anything. This talks about, is like, what animation do? Root motion, what? So this is a little sticky note about me trying to figure out how some root motion will go. Root motion is the highest bone in the skeletal hierarchy. It's where your collision box is. It's where the game engine thinks your character is. So sometimes, for the most part, you want your root bone to be underneath the hips of your character. There are situations when you would want your root bone to do other things, like in the situation of a mantle. You want to make sure that your root bone completely clears the ledge. Otherwise, you might hit the ledge and then fall back down, which sort of sucks for a player. There's also situations where if you're running as fast as you can, your hips are back here and your head is over here, and if you run straight into a wall, this entire part of my body is going to go into a wall. So making the root bone farther forward will help not collide into walls. So making sure that I talk with my engineers a lot about what do we want the root bone to do. And making sure that you talk with your rigger to make sure that the root bone is set up in a way to make sure that you're able to animate freely within Maya. Sometimes if the root bone isn't set up properly, you sort of have to delete all the information on the hips, and then the animation, can you imagine like a rolling animation, but your hips are just in the same spot? It's like really hard to animate that way. So making sure that that's set up properly and getting on the same page before the rigs are even built is important to animators. And making sure that you talk to, as animators, I talk to my design team to make sure I know what the intention of an animation is. All of this can help reduce wasted work and misalignment, leading to a lot of wasted work and wasted time. So one of the best ways to communicate to your team and to communicate to your animators is visually showing what you mean. It's sort of hard to describe with words what action you want it to look like. These are videos that I've taken of myself and sent to my team. And so these are sort of, you can see my dog right there. So a lot of the times, if I want to know if I'm headed in the right direction, before I even start animating, I'll take some videos of myself, send it to my team, get them to vote on which one they think they like best, and then it's creatively collaborating, and it makes sure that we are aligned and I'm heading in the right direction. I'm not wasting work. It's also great. I've started to do this. I start asking my team to send me videos when they're trying to describe something and I have no idea what they're talking about, which has been great. I love it. I'm not adding their videos because I don't want them to hate me. So my call action to you guys, if you're having trouble describing to your animators what you want from them, send them a video. They love it. It's great. And thank you. That's the end of my talk. So we have some Q&A time if anyone has any questions. I need some water first, so don't be fast about it. Any questions?
Hey, I was wondering how you showed us with the big guy hitting with a big sword. There was the anticipation phase, but that also is just how physics works. You can't move instantly. So I'm wondering how much of your work is based on physics, or if it just so happened to align.
You're absolutely right. Making a character that's huge, you want them to be slow so that they feel big. I break physics all the time. It's definitely my job. I'm not a physicist. I don't know how physics works a lot of the time, but making sure that something feels good is more important than making something look realistic, in my opinion. So knowing how physics works will definitely help make an animation like feel right. But making an animation responsive, I think, is more important. Game feel is king, is a term that's used pretty often. So breaking physics for the sake of game feel, I would say wins out almost every time. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question about like game feel. What are the best ways to communicate like animation feel? What is the best way to communicate this so that everyone understands the animation better?
Communicating with your team to make sure
Yeah.
the game feel? That's a great question. There's a lot of talks that my team, a game designer on my team shared a lot of talks about game feel that were really helpful for me. I think communicating with your team about how to have better game feel is I think for me, I'm a visual learner, so seeing an example of what is like good game feel is probably the best way to communicate with me, but everyone's communication style is different. So I think knowing your team and knowing how they would best understand that information is probably something you might need to think about. I think that game feel is something that has to be play tested. So game feel, if you are wondering, does my game feel good? Make sure everyone on the team plays it. And then you guys can talk about like, why does this feel not great? And how can we improve that? Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Your talk was really good, by the way.
Thank you.
One of the things I'm wondering about with the animations that you showed, a lot of them were quite unrealistic or from games with quite flexible kind of movement. You could kind of like say a cartoony and stuff. What's the best way to approach these sorts of things when realism is a really key pillar of the game? Because I know in Texas Chainsaw, like we can't get away with like having smears and stuff like that as easily because it's, you know, such a realistic thing. Like how do you still keep the game feel intact when you're really restricted by like things needing to be realistic?
Yeah, I personally love cartoony animations, which is why all the animations are really cartoony. But I think it's because it's way easier to communicate those types of things from cartoony animations. In the sense of realism, I think you can cheat it a little bit, but if you really want things to be really realistic, then I think you might, like I said before, with Voracious Games, they chose which fundamental was more important to them, and then they decided to throw fluidity out the window. I think it might be a similar thing with if you're trying to get a really realistic game, then you might have slower animations that feel maybe a little more laggy. I think that might just be the type of choice you make. There are examples of games that I think look pretty realistic, but then they change the timing. I'd say the timing is unrealistic, but the actions and poses are realistic. So maybe if you want to have more responsive animations, you can cheat the timing, but maybe avoid doing what I do all the time and like completely breaking all the bones in the body to make really sweeping animations. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me get water again.
Thank you for the talk. It was super interesting.
Thank you.
Do you have any suggestions for sound designers working on animations? And do you think, like, is there anything that sound designers maybe struggle with when working with animations in your experience?
Yeah, I haven't had a situation where a sound designer was struggling. I think it's the way that production is set up sometimes that makes it difficult for sound designers and animators to collaborate. Because in my experience working at other studios, I haven't even talked to a sound designer until like very near build lock. And then that's maybe not the best way to go about things. I know if we want to iterate on an animation that affects audio, like if I want to change the timing, all of the audio needs to be moved as well. So it makes sense that sometimes we want those interactions to be later on once we've nailed down the timing at least. But it might be something to talk about with production about how often and early we can collaborate as animators in audio. I think that when we're trying to figure out if an animation feels good, having audio in early would help us find that. I've never had a problem with like audio designers struggling. It's always been a struggle of timing about when we're collaborating, not exactly how we're collaborating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Great. Well, it's been really nerve-wracking. Thank you all for being a great audience. Yeah, and if you have any questions that you just want to share with everyone, I'll be up the stairs one of the directions. So come talk to me after. Thank you.